Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, the story of the Russian bounties as paid to the Taliban, apparently, according to U.S. media, is one that has been growing recently, ever since those media reports first came out. Now we've had Mark Milley as well as Mark Esper speaking in front of a congressional committee, saying that if proof does come forth that Russia has been paying the Taliban to attack U.S. soldiers and to kill U.S. soldiers, in fact, then they would, of course, respond. The U.S. would, of course, respond. The Russians, of course, Sergei Lavrov is saying that this is all, of course, fake news. In fact, even for this show today, we had a number of people who responded saying that this was just fake news altogether and didn't then want to come on and talk about it. But nevertheless, it is important to discuss it because if this is proven, or at least if some sort of evidence comes forth, then this opens up another front in the Russia versus U.S. Global issues as well, because we remember, of course, that there are many places around the world where the Russians and the Americans disagree and have different foreign policies towards different respective regions and countries. The Taliban, of course, have also denied this. The Taliban are saying that this is a ploy of the Afghan intelligence, in fact, to try to disrupt the possible intra-Afghan negotiations that will be beginning soon towards, hopefully, a final peaceful resolution of that issue within that country, and then to, of course, usher in peace and security for all Afghans. Let's discuss all of that a bit further, and I'm joined by Fred Weir, who is the Russia correspondent of the Christian Science Monitor. He's lived and worked in Russia for over 30 years as a journalist. He's joining us now from the Russian capital, Moscow. Fred, as always, we appreciate your time here in Scope. What do you make of the media reports that first came out about the fact that Russia may have been paying the Taliban to attack U.S. or coalition forces?
Well, the first thing I noticed, because I work for U.S. media and I read all the major newspapers every day, is how thinly sourced that story was and how it seemed calculated really to inflame American emotions. But it didn't really have a lot of detail, like names, places, dates, things that journalists could follow up on. So I did what I could do, which was to talk to Russian security experts. I can't obviously phone up the GRU and ask them and hope to get a useful answer out of them. But there is a range of people in Moscow here who do know Russian policy, Russian security interests, and they all laughed at the story. They believe it's an element of this bureaucratic civil war that's going on in Washington, in which Russia is just a boogeyman. It plays a certain role in internal American debates, and they say that to do such a thing, first of all, it's not in the traditions of the GRU or any other Russian intelligence agency to go bounty hunting and not, like indiscriminately for any American soldiers. That it makes no sense in terms of Russia's long-term policies in Afghanistan, which are not to hasten an American withdrawal. The main Russian concern, as I'm sure it is in Pakistan as well, is the fear that Afghanistan would become a failed state again, that extreme Islamists would take over if there's an abrupt withdrawal. So the Russians say we wouldn't do anything to hasten that or to aggravate the prospect of negotiations for a more orderly withdrawal. So that's what they say. Of course, you never know what the truth is in this murky world, but that's as far as I can make it out.
No, indeed. I mean, even us today, we reached out to a couple of Russian analysts, and they all laughed on our faces saying that this is just fake news, and they didn't even want to discuss it. But then on the other hand, Fred, we have the likes of Mark Milley, who was in front of Congress and said very, very confidently that in the past, he has seen, apparently, some sort of evidence for past events, not for these specific reports, that Russia has told the Taliban in some fashion to attack U.S. forces. What do you think would be Russian interests? I mean, you've laid out, of course, what Russian interests right now would be vis-a-vis Afghanistan, but then, a lot of people would look to the past, right, and see Russian involvement in the past in Afghanistan, and would possibly look at that and see why the Russians would still very much be involved in the country?
Well, the Russian security experts, again, tell me that there's no secret that Russia has made outreaches to the Taliban in the last few years as it became clear that the Americans were not going to be remaining there. The people who do remain in the region are countries like Russia, China, Pakistan. These countries have an interest, so that's how they justify an outreach to the Taliban. Maybe, and some of it was quite public. There was a Taliban delegation that came to Moscow in this Moscow format attempt to promote peace talks that failed. But maybe some of it, I mean, security experts tell me maybe there are more clandestine contacts being made with Taliban leaders, but it would be, again, to promote a moderate Taliban outcome in Afghanistan. The Russians would be trying to nudge an outcome that they could live with because their great fear is that the former Soviet Central Asia, those states, are deeply vulnerable. And they were in the 1990s, before the American invasion. And Russia really worries because that's their own underbelly.
Indeed. If we're looking around the world, as I put in introduction, there are a couple of places around the world, important places where the Russians and the Americans disagree, right? So we can point to Venezuela, Iran's nuclear deal, et cetera, et cetera. And then do you think that we'll now see another front possibly opening up when it comes to Afghanistan, on top of the fact that we've also had, ever since Donald Trump has come into office, this major anti-Russia push, right, geared towards the president specifically and just overall, both in U.S. media and the U.S. establishment?
Well, it's certainly true that in the United States, Russia looms large, and most of it is like of their own invention. Russia is a political punching bag, and it's punched far out of its weight class. I mean, having said that, I don't think Russia is a friend of the United States. I don't think it means well. And so it's really, I mean, it's clear that in places like Syria, Venezuela, the places you mentioned, there are serious antagonisms. In Ukraine, there is a real push and pull there. A lot of skullduggery, no doubt, goes on there. Afghanistan is a place where the Russian public is really allergic to any kind of involvement for obvious historical reasons. They got burned really, really badly there in the 1980s. The Soviet Union collapsed in part because of that misbegotten war. And so anything that Russian intelligence services would do, it would be really under the radar screen. And again, it's about precedent. You can say that they're antagonists and all of that, but setting up $100,000 bounties on any American soldier you kill, that is a particular, really inflammatory accusation, and one that's hard to square with past practices of Russian intelligence or Russian policy. And it really only seems to make good sense in terms of this Washington political war. Trump is a Putin stooge. He was briefed on this. He failed to react. There's Trump rolling over for the Kremlin again. That's an American discussion. It's a really heated and one that doesn't make a lot of sense to outsiders at all.
Fred, with this entire anti-Russia movement, if I may call it that, do you think that this not destroys maybe, but just lessens the possibility of more cooperation where it's needed between the Russians and the Americans? I mean, Russia is, whether the Americans like it or not, an important power around the world, has influence in many regions around the world. And I would imagine that if the Russians and the Americans were working together, and possibly are still working together behind the scenes, that they can bring in and usher in peace in many areas around the world. Does this hurt that? Well,
story of my life for the last 6 years or so has been covering this tailspin of U.S.-Russia relations. It is already worse than it ever was at the depths of the Cold War. There are very, very few points of cooperation that you just mentioned optimistically. There's almost nothing. There's some deconfliction talks going on in Syria. There's some fast-fading arms control talks. But at the diplomatic level, they've reduced, through tit-for-tat expulsions, reduced their embassy staffs to skeleton crews. Diplomatic exchanges are almost nil. And the back channels that did exist during the Cold War, where something was coming up, one general would have the phone number of his counterpart on the other side and phone him up and say, "Hey, Boris, what's going on?" They don't have any of that anymore. And so I really don't see how this story, which I frankly don't see much traction to, how this story is going to make things worse. But it certainly doesn't make it better.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word. We do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule to speak to us here in Scope. That was Fred Weir, who was speaking to us there from Moscow. Viewers, of course, we have this huge accusation placed against Russia by U.S. media. Reports saying that Russia paid up to $100,000 to the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Why would the Russians want to do that? Would it just be to spoil U.S. gains in Afghanistan in some odd way? Why would the Russians not want for intra-Afghan talks, for example, to begin, or for there to be peace in Afghanistan? As Fred there said, Russian public probably does not view the history of Russia and Afghanistan with very rosy pictures or eyes. So you would think that would be kryptonite for Russians to get involved in, especially at this time where everything seems to be headed in a fairly positive direction in the country. Regional countries certainly want there to be peace in Afghanistan because it's in their interest for there to be peace in Afghanistan, certainly. Is this another front in an anti-Russia movement within the U.S. establishment? I mean, of course, it can be said that way, but as Fred clearly also said, it's not like the Russians and the Americans are friends. They are adversaries, if we're completely honest with each other. So they're probably not looking out for each other's interests everywhere around the world, too, in other countries. So are the Russians completely innocent then? That also is a question that then remains lingering. Even when it comes to the question of Afghanistan, what is the Russian role in Afghanistan, even if just behind the scenes? We'll, of course, keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll be back with my final segment, or my next segment, I should say, after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss the fact that now it is the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre that occurred back 25 years ago, as I said, where more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were massacred by the Bosnian Serb army. Now, this was in a designated UN safe zone, in fact. Upwards of around 1,000 families are still searching today for the remains of their loved ones who would have been killed at that time. There is also very much a movement of denial that this genocide even took place on the part of not just the Bosnian Serb community, but others around the world as well. Now, of course, we remember that after the Holocaust, the world had said never again, right? But nevertheless, this genocide did still very much take place. What lessons had the world learned from the Holocaust, if any? What lessons has the world learned from Srebrenica, if any? Of course, it's important to discuss this sort of thing out, even with the controversy, quote unquote, that it creates, even though there have been war crimes trials at The Hague and the like, who have seemingly brought some form of justice, however small and minute, for those who were killed and for the families of those victims. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Eric Gordy, who is a professor of political and cultural sociology at the University College London. He is joining us now from London. Also joining us from the British capital is John Silverman, who is a professor of media and criminal justice at the University of Bedfordshire. As a journalist in the past, he's specialized in investigations about war crimes and has actually even covered the trial of Slobodan Milosevic at The Hague. He's on the regional board of the charity Remembering Srebrenica. And we're also joined then by Stefanie Kappler, who is an associate professor in conflict resolution and peace building at the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. Stefanie, Eric, and John, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Eric, let me start with you. What do you make, or how do you reflect, let me put it this way, on the 25th anniversary of the Srebrenica massacre? Have we learned the lessons from these genocides?
First, what the lessons are that ought to be learned. And, when we talk about genocide, we can go to the legal definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention, which specifies that genocide is destroying in whole or in part, a national, racial, religious, or ethnic group. That is, it involves being targeted because of some aspect of their identity, which is usually a part of their identity that is not chosen. And this is the kind of danger that we still see present. It hasn't been eliminated, and the social divisions and inequalities that contribute to violence haven't been eliminated. Which is why you still see great discomfort among Muslim people and other minorities in Europe. You see conflicts about the protection or violence toward African Americans and other minorities in the United States. So all of these problems come from social division, discrimination, lack of understanding, and they are still just as much with us as they were when the Genocide Convention was passed 50 years ago, as when the genocide in Srebrenica happened 25 years ago, or 100 years ago.
Yeah. Indeed. What are your thoughts on that? Because, as I put in my introduction, after the Holocaust, you would have thought that the world would have ensured something like this would not have happened. Why do you think it is that the world wasn't able to stop this, even within, as I said, a UN safe zone?
Yeah, I would very much be in agreement with what Professor Gordy just said. I think it's a real global problem that we're facing. And of course, it kind of had a very terrible impact in the case of Bosnia, because there was a lot of power struggles around land, around identity, around power, around economic influence, and so on and so forth. So in a way, that's one of the reasons why Bosnia was hit so hard by this violence. And I think we're still very much learning what it means to deal with violence and what it means to deal with this in an ethical way. And that, on the one hand, means dealing with apologies and the acknowledgement that this violence happened in order to restore the dignity to those who suffered so much from what has happened, but also to engage with questions of reparations. And I think they're often key to understanding why we're quite reluctant to engaging with these kinds of violence and making sure it doesn't happen again. Because, of course, the moment you acknowledge that something terrible has happened, that a genocide has happened, you open debates around reparations, about who should be compensating the victims, who counts as a victim. And I think these are all very contested and controversial questions, and they are very difficult, I suppose, for the victims to deal with, because they know what they've been through and they keep struggling for recognition of that very suffering.
Indeed. And, John, it's hard to imagine, but I mean, it's true that a lot of people, even today, would view the likes of who we would call war criminals, those who carried out those crimes in Srebrenica, as actually heroes, right? Many of them, have been welcomed by the Bosnian Serb community or others as heroes, right? So we can probably list many of those names. What are your thoughts of that? Because that complicates, right? If you're not even willing to accept that these men have done wrong, how does one then take the next step?
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, you're right, and I think this comes down to different narratives of the past. We've seen this in divided communities in many, many parts of the world, where you get one community, and it starts with education, I think, being taught one version of the past, and the other community learning something very different. I mean, when I was in Bosnia, I remember going into a number of bars and other places in what is now the Bosnian Serb Republic, Republika Srpska, and seeing pictures on the wall of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic when they were both on the run, and they were regarded as heroes by the Bosnian Serbs. Of course, the world has designated them through the International Criminal Tribunal as war criminals. And until one can get some kind of shared narrative of the past, and indeed the present, if you look at Myanmar, for example, the majority community there do not regard the Rohingya as part of that country. The Rohingya themselves have been there a certain number of years, generations. They regard themselves as Burmese. So it's these polarized narratives that I think sow the seeds of continued division and hatred And, the never again after the Holocaust has seemed one of the most hollow commitments, I think, of our lifetime.
Indeed. And so on that point then, Eric, that John there just made, because if we do look at Myanmar, right, many people do call that genocide also, even though that's not being proven, I believe, legally, if I'm not mistaken. Nevertheless, so do you think that today, in the year 2020, they were well placed to prevent genocide, or have we not yet recognized, for example, the very valid point that unless your education system isn't willing to actually speak about the facts as they were or as they are, we're not actually going to make that step forward to actually having a world where we recognize history as it actually played out?
Well, I think this is really the challenge. I mean, you do what you can to address violence, to try to prevent it as much as possible. But the way to really effectively prevent it is to eliminate the conditions that lead to violence. And what that means is promoting understanding. We talk a lot about history and what ought to be memorialized in history, and too often what this involves is a narrow conception of history. History is a celebration of heroic figures and heroic moments. But one thing that, at least I hope we're learning now in this movement about debates over monuments and what monuments should be kept and should be removed and so on, is that history is not only a source of celebration of heroism or uplifting rhetoric, but it is also a source of obligations and responsibilities. What history is the set of burdens that we are required to address in order to achieve peace within our societies, and it's only societies that are at peace with themselves that are going to be capable of making peace with other societies.
Indeed. What are your thoughts about Stefanie? Because, there has been so much historical revisionism, right? As Eric there pointed out, of course, we do, in our respective nations, view our histories with very rosy lens, don't we? We sort of see everything as having gone very well, even though that's rarely the truth in any respective nation. Right? It's always a combination of both good and bad.
Absolutely. And I think, being located in Western Europe, the lack of engagement with our own colonial histories and the lack of knowledge and the lack of education on that in curricula in schools, I think is really telling in that respect. And I think perhaps one of the issues I see is that we often see peace as it takes place as the opposite of war. But actually, if you look at peace as almost a continuation of war, is something that tells us a bit more about the inequalities that persist after the end of war. Who actually writes that history? Who gets to transport their memories into the public sphere? Whose statues do we actually put up? In terms of how peace is organized in Bosnia specifically, I think it's quite evident that peace is almost set up in very similar ways as the war was set up. We've got similar dividing lines. There was not really a possibility or an attempt to overcome those dividing structures that were actually institutionalized during the war. And you see that now in terms of how schooling is organized, that depending on your ethnic background, you go to a different school, you learn different languages. Also, although it's a similar, almost the same language, you will learn a language which is called differently, you will learn a different kind of history. And then if we understand who benefits from the ways in which peace is constructed, and in terms of what it means, in terms of the inequalities that emerge, I think that brings us closer to understanding why a lot of the times the discourses and narratives that are established during war are so persistent after war has formally ended.
John, and another issue that comes up when we're talking about Srebrenica and that whole issue that occurred in those years is the international community's response at that time, right? Many people say that we should have had a much tougher international community response. They should have, in fact, protected these people from day one anyhow. But then there's others who respond and say, listen, we've had in these ensuing years that involvement in places like Iraq and even Libya, and that's been horrible, right? That's not worked out very well in removing those quote-unquote respective dictators. What are your thoughts on that? Like, should we have had further international intervention at that point in time?
Well, it's a very interesting and rather complex area that you've opened up with that question. Certainly at the time in 1994, 1995, I think countries like the UK and many countries in Western Europe were still almost restricted by the legacy of the Second World War. I mean, the UK and the Conservative government in this country started off when Bosnia exploded, believing that the Serbs were probably the good guys because during the Second World War, many of them had fought on the Allied side, and that the Croats, who had been pro-Nazi, were the bad guys. And there was this simplistic narrative that I think affected attitudes from government ministers right up to and even beyond the genocide at Srebrenica. Later on, of course, we moved into this era that's become known as liberal interventionism, which began probably with Kosovo, NATO airstrikes in Kosovo, and then Sierra Leone. And there was a period when that seemed to herald a kind of new age of world concern for violence in many parts of the world. But after Iraq in 2003, and particularly later on, I think the intervention in Libya in 2011, which brought down Gaddafi, that things began to go wrong after that, and the world kind of split into a Western view and particularly a Russian-dominated view. And since then, we've seen Syria and we've seen Myanmar and Yemen and various places where there is no appetite certainly on the part of the West, to intervene.
So what are your thoughts, Eric, about that? Do we need more interventions? Because arguably it's nice to say, listen, we need to all coexist and all the above, but there are dictators around the world, even today. And if they were to then go around killing their own people, there would need to be some mechanism of protecting those people, right? So were interventions such as Iraq or otherwise a good thing? Or back in 1995, 94, when Srebrenica was occurring, should there have been more intervention then?
There are occasions where the use of military force can help. I mean, I would say the conquest of Srebrenica by the army of Republika Srpska may have been one of those, and there was a battalion of peacekeepers from the Netherlands that were under UN command, monitoring the zone. And when the invasion began, they requested that the UN provide air cover to slow down the offensive, to allow for them to protect refugees. This was refused. Would the killings have been prevented if it had not been refused? It's possible. We don't know. There are some other similar situations where intervention probably could have helped. The commander of the UN forces in Rwanda at the time of the genocide there in 1993, General Dallaire, Canadian general, estimated that if he had 5,000 troops from the United Nations, that he would have been able to stop the genocide. So these are instances where the use of force is appropriate. The reason that this is controversial is that the doctrine of using force to protect civilians has been invoked to justify some wars in which civilians were not protected. So if we want to talk about the invasion and occupation of Iraq, or the efforts to support various paramilitary groups in Syria, these are interventions that have definitely backfired. You could make the argument that that there were not interventions that were made for a legitimate reason or with a legitimate plan.
Stefanie, what are your thoughts on that? Because it seems that on one hand we have, where there wasn't enough intervention, the world didn't do enough in Srebrenica, and then on the other hand, now we've seemed to have gone to the other extreme where the world just intervenes almost, I don't want to say everywhere, of course, that'll be a huge generalization and overstatement, but it seems in many more places around the world, and that also isn't working out that well.
Yeah, I would add to this perhaps that we must not think that intervention is generally an altruistic move. I think if that were the case, that would be nice, and I think that's how it was originally intended. But I think we mustn't forget that there are often interests that come into play in terms of where somebody, some country, some organization intervenes and where they don't. And I think that's important because in a way, my opinion would be if intervention is to be successful, it has to be about the protection of lives. And I think one of the reasons why a lot of times intervention goes wrong is because it doesn't manage to protect human lives, but actually creates more victims. And then it becomes a real problem. And perhaps just to add to this, I think there are other forms of intervention that are rarely considered. So in a way, I think specifically the Bosnian War was very often scripted as a localized ethnic civil war. But of course, there had been intervention much before the actual violence erupted in terms of how the different states became independent and how that was being dealt with in diplomatic terms by external countries. And I think these kinds of interventions, they're rarely regarded as interventions, but of course they did set the scene for what was to follow as well.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a final word, but we all three of our guests, Stefanie, Eric, and John, for their time and, of course, their expert insight. We sincerely appreciate them pulling this all into context for us. Certainly the world hopefully is reflecting 25 years later from what happened in Srebrenica, the massacre that occurred there. We do not want to repeat that again. Nevertheless, in the ensuing years, there have been genocides and massacres that have occurred. And then also, on the other hand, as we've discussed, interventions as well in many places around the world that have also not worked. So the world needs to find the balance. Where is it correct to intervene to protect people, and where is it not correct to intervene and, quote unquote, protect people? Of course, many lessons for the world still to learn. Even now, as I said, 1,000+ families do not have the remains of their loved ones. Closure has not occurred yet for many of these innocent families and their family members who have died, etc. I'll be back with my final segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss an Oxfam report, a worrying Oxfam report, which says potentially we could have more people dying of hunger because of the effects of COVID-19 than of the virus itself. Now, of course, it's not a competition about who dies from what, but nevertheless, it's an important statistic to talk about because Oxfam says around 120+ million people by the end of just this year, I believe, could die or could be at the brink of starvation because of the socioeconomic factors brought around due to the effects of COVID-19 around the world. Now, one of the important parts in the report, which really got to me, and I want to read it off as an exact quote, is that Oxfam says that at the top, people are continuing to make a profit even amongst this pandemic. So it says 8 of the biggest food and drink companies have paid out over $18 billion to their stakeholders, or shareholders, I should say, since January of this year, even as the pandemic was spreading, as we know, across the globe. That amount is 10 times more than the United Nations says is needed to stop people from going hungry around the world. That just baffles my mind, and that's something that I want to discuss now, along with, of course, the entire issue of hunger around the world with our guest who is joining us now from Washington, D.C. this morning. We're joined by Mary K. Ryan, who is an incoming assistant professor of political science and public policy at Washington and Jefferson College. Mary, thank you for your time. What do you make of the Oxfam report about more people possibly dying because of the effects of COVID-19?
Thank you so much for having me. Absolutely. The Oxfam report is very concerning, and I think it needs to be taken very seriously. The World Food Program is basically estimating double the amount of global deaths from hunger in 2020 as a result of the impacts of COVID-19. And we're seeing this happen in a variety of ways. And so I think it's really important for us to understand that some of the massive geopolitical challenges that we're experiencing globally in our desire to manage COVID-19 have very real world impacts for people all over the globe. Yeah. And so, you know, on some simple level, we have heard a lot about job losses and incomes being cut. The International Labor Organization expects that the loss of working hours in April, May, and June combined is equivalent to 305 million full-time jobs around the world. It's staggering implications. We know that the quarantine lockdown measures that were taken have, potentially unintended consequences on food access for people all over the world, especially in places like Philippines and India. We know that it's been harder to transport food in some places around the world, largely due to trade restrictions that have been imposed as a result of COVID. And this is a big problem in Russia, for example. We also know that borders were closed and supply routes have been closed in some countries. We've seen this in Yemen. Rising food prices in grocery stores and the existence of panic buying has amounted to depressed purchasing power for individual people. And so this is compounded with things like oil prices crashing and remittances between countries being down. We've seen travel restrictions around the world, particularly resulting in hardship for countries that rely on migrant labor.
Yeah.
So there's all of these, really real world political challenges that governments have attempted to impose to manage COVID-19 that are resulting in day-to-day hunger for people as a result of the pandemic. There's a survey and study from Johns Hopkins University in conjunction with Oxfam that suggests that there are anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 deaths per day globally due to hunger as a result of the pandemic.
Interesting, Mary, if I may come in, I wanted to ask, one of the things that really struck me in the Oxfam report was, again, just the talk of inequality around the world, right? And this is certainly not, of course, just due to the pandemic, but is just seemingly being really highlighted because of the pandemic and how unequal all of us around the world are in how we respectively face the pandemic, A, and B, how people are still very much making money off of this, right? So as in you have these major corporations, not all of them, of course, but some of them who are still very much making a lot of money and their shareholders are still very much making a lot of money. And that just, again, goes to highlight, doesn't it, how unequal our world really is and how little is being done to address that as a long-term solution?
Absolutely. And in many ways, COVID is not presenting new challenges to this inequality. It's simply exasperating a lot of the existing problems that were already in place. But what we are seeing is a need to really build more resilient communities that can plant and harvest their own food, that are not suffering from disruption of production and supply. Now, some of those companies have made measures to address some of these issues, but obviously those kinds of gains are also existing because of panic buying, right? They're benefiting from the situation that's being created as a result of the way that governments are handling COVID-19. So there's no doubt that we need to look more intensely at the United Nations appeal to manage COVID-19 in a way that we provide aid to those who need it most. And we consider canceling the debts, for example, of developing countries so that we can free up more funds to aid social protection and health care. Yeah. These are the kinds of things that we need to really be focusing on so that we can address some of the lack of sustainability in our food systems, and we can prioritize food producers and workers instead of agribusiness. And some of the ways that we're seeing this massive income inequality reflected is because of the prioritization of these massive agribusiness companies instead of citizens and people that are struggling to survive around the world. And certainly we're seeing, different amounts of this problem. I mean, there are very basic ways that we can reimagine what we consider to be essential services. And we've seen this, even here in the United States, we've typically thought of essential services, such as healthcare providers or medical workers. But even here in the U.S., in the wake of COVID-19, the coronavirus has suggested that grocery store employees are essential services. That is not something that we would have seen even a year ago in the United States. And so the ways in which we have come to reimagine and revalue individual people is a trend that we ought to favor around the world. We need to be building sustainable food systems and more resilient communities and reducing income equality.
And hopefully we will be able to get to that point soon, Mary. I do apologize. We'll have to leave it there at that. I know it's been a short and sweet conversation, and we've only really touched the iceberg, tip of the iceberg, I should say, on this really important issue of hunger and how COVID-19 is playing out around the world. But we really appreciate your time this morning. That was Mary Kay Ryan speaking to us from Washington, D.C., and sharing, of course, her expert insight with us on this issue. Hunger is only being highlighted even more because of COVID-19. It's an issue which has always existed, unfortunately, around the world. We haven't been able to overcome hunger, though there have been years where hunger has lessened seemingly around the world, where the world has, in those years, done better in addressing the needs of those countries who are going through respective issues in how they're able to feed their own people. But at the same time, as I put in the Oxfam report, the part that really worries me and really baffles me is how we have those who are very much still getting rich off of this situation. Now, is it down to panic buying, as Mary there mentioned, or agribusiness? I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around about how we have these global structures designed and how it affects people on the ground. But again, we rarely speak about the human angle of these things. We're always just worried about profits, aren't we, when it comes to corporations? That's also something which we really need to change. We really need to change the way we think. It has to be human-centered, less than just profit-centered enterprises as well, to be able to deal with these things in a proper fashion going forward. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.